everyone, so I'm here today to do my February reading wrap-up where I run through basically all the books that I read in the month of February and let you know what I thought of them and what I rated them on my Goodreads page. On my last wrap-up for January, I got some really nice feedback from people who enjoyed watching these videos because I'm always a little bit unsure about how much I should mix in my book videos with my project panning and beauty videos, but I got some really nice feedback, so I'm just going to keep doing these. If you don't want to watch them, you don't have to, but if you do, please enjoy. So the first book that I read in February was The Flamethrowers by Rachel Kushner. I mentioned it in my last update because I was halfway through it, I think, and I wasn't enjoying it, and I didn't enjoy it. I had a friend of mine describe it as like a retelling of the Allen Ginsberg-Patti Smith relationship, and I think that's a pretty accurate description. It was like two artsy people who don't live a particularly interesting life, but because they're artsy, it's framed as though everything they do is interesting. There's a little bit of interesting information about Italian trade unions and laborers, and that disconnects between the rich men who own the companies and the poor men who work at them, but it didn't get into very much detail, and like there was this big I guess controversy between the two characters, or a big reveal, and it wasn't even that interesting, so I just didn't think it was very good, and I gave it 1 out of 5 stars. Next, I picked up 2 books from Rainbow Rowell. The first one was Attachments and the second one was Landline. I'd never read a Rainbow Rowell book before, but I'd heard about her a lot here on YouTube, and I decided to pick up 2 from the library. Her first one, Attachments, I think was her debut novel. I'm not entirely sure, but it's basically a love story between 2 people who work in the same office building but in different departments. The man in the story is in charge of reading the emails of the woman that he falls in love with. It's a weird kind of like security process they have at the office that they work in. He ends up falling in love with her, and then it's like basically how they meet and fall in love and kind of thing like that. So it was just a really sweet story. It's not the kind I usually read, but I thought it was pretty cute and I enjoyed reading it, so I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next one I read was Landline, and this again is kind of a love story, but it's about 2 people who are married and they have a fight over Christmas. One of them goes back home to his family and she stays in California by herself over the Christmas period, and then she figures out that her phone in her old family home calls her husband's phone in the past from before they got married. So she starts kind of talking to her husband in the past, and that's basically the premise of the story. I just thought it was really, really drawn out. There was a lot of drama that was rehashed over and over and over again. I didn't find it very interesting, and I didn't really enjoy reading it, so I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Next, I picked up a book for my uni classes. This is Ways of Seeing by Berger, which is a book adaptation of the documentary film that he made, I think in the 70s, the 1970s, basically about the way we look at art. He mostly talks here about visual art, like paintings and statues and things like that, and I just found it really quite interesting. I think the thing that stood out the most to me is the way that he talks about the representation of women. He talked a lot about gaze and a lot about how men are often represented as the viewers and women as the viewed, but the way he talked about it, the language he used, kind of made it seem like that was a position that the women had chosen to occupy, as though women go around choosing to be viewed by men, and I just found that odd, and perhaps he just didn't make enough of a distinction that these roles that we play are imposed upon us by the society we live in and are not like objective choices. So like I said, I read this for uni, so it's not particularly interesting if aesthetics and gaze are not something you're interested in, but I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I picked up some poetry, also for my uni classes. This is Anne Vickery's Devious Intimacy. Anne Vickery is an Australian academic who recently took a turn in poetry writing and publishing. It was a pretty good collection. I really liked how, I guess, feminist her poetry is, but I don't think I particularly loved her style or her tone, so I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And then more poetry. This is Ladylike by Lilley, who is also an Australian academic and poet. She's the daughter of Dorothy Hewitt. If you've ever heard of that Australian poet, this is her daughter, and she has been writing poems for absolutely ages. This is one of her collections. I really like the work of Kate Lilley in the way that she grapples and includes things like pop culture and found poetry and I guess like modern day interests. She integrates into her poetry really well, so I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next, we moved on to something a bit different. This is a short story collection called A Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin, and it is pronounced Lucia, not Lucia, which I found out after having read this book. This was recommended to me by a friend who was reading it at the time, and it has been quite talked about a lot recently. These stories were mostly written through the 70s, 80s, and 90s prior to Lucia Berlin's death. Some of them I think were published during her lifetime, but most of them were not, or at least most of them have not been as acclaimed as they are now as when she was alive. What I found particularly interesting about Lucia Berlin's writing style is it is very sharp. Her stories are, they don't contain a lot of imagery, I guess, or a lot of lyricism. They're quite sharp, pointed stories, and I found that it's a pretty aggressive style of writing, and I enjoyed it because it was different, and it is quite a good way of telling short stories when you don't have a lot of time. But I just found a lot of the stories circled around the same ideas. In her lifetime, she was an alcoholic, and a lot of her stories are semi-autobiographical or basically just autobiographical about a woman who is intensely alcoholic. So it jumps in between her life period. So there are some when she was quite old and after she had a family and she was mourning the death of her mother. And then there were stories that flash back to before she got married, when she was traveling the world and meeting a lot of different people, experiencing a lot of different things. And it would kind of jump in between different periods of her life. But overall, all of the stories had pretty much the same tone to them, which meant that it felt like I was reading a mixed up novel, except for some of the things I couldn't believe to be true because some of them were not true across stories, if that makes sense. Like, she would mention something about herself and then in the next story that wouldn't have been true. So it's like I was reading an untrustworthy novel, basically. And it was okay, I enjoyed it, but it wasn't my favorite style of short story writing, and I can't say that I loved it. So I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. And then we're on to more poems. I think I'm going to be mentioning a lot of poetry in these wrap-ups from now on because I am writing a thesis on poetry this year, which means I'm going to be reading a lot of poetry, but maybe it'll slow down later this year. I'm not totally sure. This is Michael Farrell's Cockles Joy. Michael Farrell is a modern-day Australian poet who writes, I guess, a lot about queerness or gayness. He is a gay man, and he mentions a lot in his poems being in relationships with men or being a gay man in the modern day. And I like that because that's a perspective I don't read a whole lot of, and I certainly don't read a lot of in poetry. If you've not read a lot of poetry, it's often cis-het, it's often told from perspectives of women or from white men, so this was a really nice, kind of different style of poetry. But overall, I can't really say I enjoyed his style really at all. There were a few poems in it that stood out to me, but otherwise I just gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next, another Australian writer. I've read a lot of Australian work this month. This is The Children by Charlotte Wood. You might be familiar with Charlotte Wood's work. She wrote The Natural Way of Things in 2015, which won the Stella Prize for Women's Literature last year as well. This was one of her first novels. I think not her first novel, but one of her first. And basically it follows one woman who is a war journalist, and she returns home to Australia because her father has fallen off of the roof and is in critical care in the hospital. So it's about her reconnecting with her husband, who she's sort of estranged from, her sister and her mother, and basically her small Australian town in general. There is a really odd relationship in here between her and a caretaker at the hospital girl who recognizes her but she doesn't recognize him, and a major point of the story is her trying to remember how he knows her and what kind of shared history they have, because he seems a little bit unhinged and no one can really tell if he means what he's saying or if he's kind of imagining what's going on. It was a pretty good story. I read it in a few days. It was rather fast, but it wasn't all that gripping. I think the most interesting parts of it were the flashbacks or the little minor stories about her being a war journalist. I find it really interesting, Australian writers' fascination with war journalism. I find it more frequently occurs in Australian stories than in any other novels that I read, and I find that juxtaposition between like small town Australian life and war journalism very interesting, and I see it recurring in a really interesting way. So I'm thinking particularly of like Questions of Travel, which is another Australian novel that kind of juxtaposes small Australian life with like war-torn Middle East. But anyway, that's probably another topic. I thought this was a pretty good story. It's probably not my favorite, probably not her best either, but I'm slowly working my way through all of Charlotte Wood's work, kind of trying to see how she led up to writing The Natural Way of Things, which I think is probably one of the best Australian novels I've ever read and is incredibly powerful on a global level instead of just on a national scale. So I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. And then we're still talking about poetry. This is the Breakbeat Poets New American Poetry in the Age of Hip Hop, edited by Kevin Coval, Karashi Ali Lozana, and Nate Marshall. I'm sorry if I pronounced any of those wrong, but this is basically a collection of poetry spanning, I think, from about the 60s, but probably earlier than that for some of them. And it's all sort of poets and poetry that have been influenced by hip hop and by that general music scene as well. I found it really, really engaging. A lot of these poems have to do with race or with institutionalized violence or with lots of different problems that American people face and people face outside of America really, but this is centralized in America. I really enjoyed pretty much the entire collection, and I would highly recommend it not only to people who love poetry but people who don't read a lot of poetry. I think a lot of the work in here is really engaging, very easy to read, and isn't that kind of like highbrow, high culture, untouchable tone or style that a lot of the poetry we read in schools is like. I don't think you need to know a lot about poetry or hip hop or race or America to read this. I think it's a really interesting collection. I would highly recommend it. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. And then lastly, this is the book that I'm currently reading. This is New and Selected Poems by Gig Ryan, who is an Australian poet as well. This is a collection that spans a few of her collections from I think about the 70s or 80s. I purchased it mostly to read her earlier work because I'm really interested in early feminist poetry. And that's basically why I purchased this, but I think it's really interesting also to see the span or to see the growth of an artist over time. So I'm really enjoying it so far. I'm only about this far, but I will honestly probably finish it today, and then I'll move on to a few other things. So there you go, a very poetry, a very Australian heavy wrap up this month. Please let me know if you've read any of these works. I highly doubt that any of you have, because Australian and poetry are not popular genres here on YouTube. But let me know if you have any questions or want to know anything more about anything that I'm reading. Like I said, I am going to be reading a lot of poetry this year because I'm reading it for my thesis. If that's going to be boring for you, then I'm really sorry, but I'll see you next year when I'll be reading more novels. But I'm going to do my best to integrate some novels and some non-fiction in as well. I, again, will be reading a lot of non-fiction, and hopefully, because I'm also focusing on pop culture in my thesis, it'll be some things that are interesting and relevant and not just like aesthetics. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.